aborting more than 1 of every 4 pregnancies, creating human clones, eliminating our elderly with euthanasia. Is this how we should deal with human life? Find out how you can make a difference in changing our culture in this edition of Life Matters. And now here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Welcome back to Life Matters. We're your program on the right to life, on the culture that emanates from the idea that there's even a thing called the right to life, and on the battle of ideas to suppress that thought. It's a very real battle. Yes, there's a battle of ideas. It's raging all around you. It's heard on television and on the radio. It's heard constantly in our society. And if you don't realize this battle of ideas is to get you to quit thinking and instead follow emotions, to substitute your emotions for rational thought. If you don't realize that's the goal of others in this battle, then you're going to lose. Because emotions are very, very powerful. And today we're going to talk again about a very special and important issue, the legalizing of medical killing of those who are medically and emotionally vulnerable, what's known as physician-assisted suicide. We have a regular guest, Nancy Valko. You can hear more about Nancy and read some of her information at nancyvalko.com. She is going to share about this issue and the folly of thinking that voluntary euthanasia is any better than any other form of euthanasia, because it's emotions of the victim that are propelling this along. And it's the reason that suicide has been frowned on by society for thousands of years, and especially the idea of assisting in a suicide. Why that has been condemned for thousands of years, because suicide is the number one indicator. The idea of having suicide indicates that someone is depressed, seriously depressed, and they don't need to be killed to end that depression. They need intervention and help. So we're going to talk with Nancy in just a little bit. The idea that suicide is voluntary is a real myth, but I want you to know that you've got to be prepared. This is now legalized in California. We're fighting the court battle. Whatever happens in that court battle, ultimately, the argument is in the air. The emotions are what are propelling this along, and people are not thinking it through. And the cost, not only to the individuals, but to society itself, if medicine is free to kill anybody who asks.
Life Matters continues after this.
You know, you're pretty amazing. The reason I can say that is America's founders said that about you. That's right. They said that every human being is created by a creator and given rights by that creator. Those rights are not given by the government. It's the government's job to protect those rights. And the very first and most important is the right to be alive, the right to life. If you want to be involved in the national effort, go to nrlc.org.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Well, thank you for joining us on Life Matters. We're your program on the right to life, on the culture that emanates from that singular idea, the idea that every human life is unique and endowed with that uniqueness by a creator, and that the duty of government is to protect vulnerable, innocent lives. Now, I didn't make that up. That's what our founders, the founders of the American nation, said is the first and most essential right, and it comes from a self-evident truth. It's self-evident. You're a human being. You didn't create yourself, and the government didn't make you. In fact, the government has a duty to protect the governed. And so this right to life is very, very significant. And if you don't understand what it is, if it's wrapped up in your feelings and emotions about babies, if that's what you understand the right to life is, then you're not fully ready for the battle of ideas, because there's a battle now over this. There's a battle for the culture that has come to us that at one time did respect the right to life. We had a life-affirming culture. That culture is under serious attack. And if you're not involved in protecting both the lives and the culture and laws that protect other lives, then you're going to lose. I'm sorry, you will if you're not prepared to understand this. Today, we have Nancy Valko back. We're always glad to have her. And we're going to talk about an important aspect of this battle, and that's the notion of voluntary. You know, if someone wants to die, Who are we to deny that? We're just pushing our religion on them. We're making them suffer. They want it. They want to die. And so you hear that a lot. I don't need to wear that out, but there's something deeper you need to examine. And I have found it. I've seen it happening in nursing homes and other places. Nancy has told us many, many experiences that she has personally seen this in. And in reality, the euthanasia movement, they actually get tired of waiting for people to volunteer. They actually have a condescending view of other human beings. There are certain people who should be dead. And if you haven't read up on the euthanasia programs that have been government supported and sponsored in Germany, the T4 program of Germany, that's what led to the Holocaust, is Germans felt there were certain human beings that should be dead. They're no longer worthy of care. They're no longer worthy of giving them food even. They were useless eaters, is what the Germans said of those with disabilities. And so voluntary euthanasia is not their goal, because sometimes, I'll be honest, the wrong people volunteer and it embarrasses them. They're not talking about jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge when someone's depressed. That kind of is embarrassing for them. What they want is they want certain people to step up and understand they should be dead. And sometimes those people won't do it. So it's up to them to implement the best course of action. So we're going to talk about the deceitfulness of a voluntary euthanasia, that is to say, assisted suicide, and then other forms of assisted suicide, such as voluntary cessation of food and fluids. That's a big phrase now. Be ready for it. Nancy, tell us about this idea of voluntary. Let's start with just suicide. What do we know about suicide?
Well, there's so much that we know about suicide, and most of the time there's depression, all sorts of things. I have had personal experience talking to people about suicide and working with them. And also I've had a daughter who committed suicide. Unfortunately, she did it using an assisted suicide technique. And I think her case and what happened to her is very instructive. For years, I talked about suicide contagion with this so-called physician-assisted suicide, that we're giving people the wrong message. In fact, the World Health Organization, and we have national guidelines on how, like, newspapers and the media should report on suicide. And one thing is, don't glamorize it, don't make it look good, don't give the technique that happened. You know, you don't want to get anybody else any ideas. There's a lot of vulnerable people out there. And I knew that. And I'd worked with suicidal people, including some who were terminally ill. And I never lost anyone until my own daughter, who at the age of 14 became addicted to drugs and everything else, in and out of rehab, doing well, then not doing so well. There's a lot of us parents out there. It's a tough, tough thing. I know, lots of prayers. But when she was 30, she had had some suicidal problems and she'd been admitted, and I had recently gotten her into a new program. And she told me one day, she says, "Mom, I know how to do it." I go, "What?" She said, "I read the book Final Exit by the euthanasia proponent, Derek Humphrey. It's like a self-suicide book. He believes suicide is a civil right." And she had read it. She says, "I know how to do it." And so I talked to her and we talked her out of it. We thought, let people know, and her friends. And, you know, you have any problems, you call me immediately. Don't tell me I was suicidal last week. It's a difficult thing when you've got a 30-year-old. And then I got the call. And she had done it. And we thought it was an overdose at first. But as one of the detectives was taking me to pick up her things, she said, "Well, you know, the medical examiner said something I don't understand." And I said, "What?" And the medical examiner told her my daughter's way of doing her suicide was, quote, "textbook final exit," unquote. She goes, "What does that mean?" And I explained it. She goes, "Oh my God. Oh my God." She fell for and it was not dignified. It was not beautiful. I did not know exactly what it was until I got the autopsy report. And then I went, oh yes, that's what she did, because I knew how these things are done. And it was pretty horrible. And people say it's peaceful. It's not. But they're doing this. They actually have suicide websites. My daughter had gone to the assisted suicide websites where they talked about terminal sedation and stopping eating and drinking and, get medicine from a doctor. Crazy stuff is out there. But some people, like my daughter, are just so susceptible. And we had saved her so many times, but in the end, we didn't do it. Because of her case, though, and I do talk about it, many people have changed. We have saved many lives by telling her story. But they talk about this voluntary thing. So what they did is they talk about physician-assisted suicide, and they were all perturbed about that. We've got to get that changed. So when Brittany Maynard in 2014 announced that she had a terminal brain cancer and was going to commit suicide when she turned 30, and she was a newlywed, but she couldn't do it in her state of California. She went to Oregon where she could do it, and the whole family moved up there. People magazine had a 6-page thing on her. From baby pictures on, they asked for donations. They started the Brittany Maynard Foundation.
That's right. It was the George Soros Foundation, by the way, that gave $1 million for that one promotion. You don't accidentally get Brittany Maynard on the cover of People magazine and front page of every newspaper in America unless you have access to the media. And so this is pushing.
Very, very sympathetic. They're as sympathetic to assisted suicide as they are to abortion. That's a really sad thing, but they've gone all in. And with Brittany Maynard, what they had been trying to get for so long, they finally got. The media started calling it physician aid in dying or death with dignity. And one thing they found from studies, they go, well, if people can't do it, then they'll jump off bridges and things like that. The studies show no, it increases suicides. Suicides in Oregon, I think, went up like 11% above the national average after they got this assisted suicide. I talked to one media person. I said, they have down there that every time you talk about this, you should have the suicide hotline number. And she did put it in. I said, that's a big thing on it. It gives people ideas. Right now, since we've legalized assisted suicide, our suicide rate in the U.S. is up 30%. But they have convinced the suicide prevention organizations from getting involved in assisted suicide. No, that's different. It's rational. It's not suicide. It's aid in dying. And I've worked so hard on trying to get them not to discriminate when it comes to suicide. The same things we would do for someone who is suicidal, which is a medical health exam. We get them help. We do all sorts of things, like we would talk people off a ledge. That is all missing with physician aid in dying. And now with this physician aid in dying, say Oregon, over 90% of the people come from hospice. In Washington State, 93% of its assisted suicides were assisted by an end-of-life Washington volunteer, not a medical person. There's no safeguards. I wrote a blog on 6 problems with assisted suicide. It's at least 6 problems. But they have to falsify the death certificate, supposedly for privacy. It's all self-reporting. The doctor doesn't have to be there. Any doctor can do it. They just give it out. And a third of the patients don't even take the medication, but they said, oh, that's fine. It makes them feel better in case they want to. And of course, I was really big on that because I did home hospice. We would get rid of all drugs. People had grandchildren, other members of the family. We have an opioid epidemic of people taking those kinds of drugs out of their parents or their grandparents' medicine cabinet. It has done nothing for suicide except increase it. And it's a funny thing. I always say we have better stories than the other side does. And a few years ago, Wesley Smith let me know there was a big article in one of the women's magazines about Nancy Valko and her wonderful assisted suicide. And this woman in Oregon with the same name as me had a party, and they released balloons, and everybody was all for it. And it was so great. And he put out a thing saying, this is not our Nancy Valko. I thought it was sadly funny. And then that was like 2009. It was right before my daughter died. And last year, a friend called and said, Women's Day has a whole thing on the wonderful death of Nancy Valko. They repackaged the same thing.
It's being marketed, and you need to recognize, just as the beer you drink or any other decision you make, it's marketed to you.
At one point, they actually had a website. Someone told me about it, and I found it, where they offered help to TV programs, and you'd see it on Law and Order and stuff like that, where they would give them storylines and help them with that.
This is a cultural war we're in, and it's really aimed at people that they think should be dead, and that this is somehow a good thing, that if certain people will just take it on themselves, it needs to occur to you that you should be dead. The implication, the blowback, is that there's a lot of other people who hear it as well, because by glorifying suicide, and I want to make an important distinction. The change in language is important. They drop suicide because suicide literally means to kill. The CIDE is the suffix for killing. And when you say aid in dying, that's not actually true. It's killing. And what we have is a misunderstanding. We're all going to die. We all know that. Every one of us will die, and hopefully we will die peaceably in our bed at night. But this is not about that. This is not about dying. This is not about nature taking its course. There's nothing natural about what they're promoting. This is about an intervention that, yes, uses medicine, but this isn't medicine. Medicine is meant to benefit people. This is actually poison. It is to kill. This is aid in killing. And this misuse of language and misrepresentation of language is where the battle is. If you don't see that distinction, if you don't see that, no, wait, this is not about helping someone who's dying. This is about killing them. Mother Teresa would help people who were dying. This isn't what this is. And you have to start there if you're going to really understand the rest of these arguments. So this is so insidious. It's so seductive. There's one other aspect, though, Nancy, and thank you. And again, we share your tragedy about your daughter. It's almost beyond words. But we also now see that this voluntary cessation of food and fluids has become very common in many long-term care facilities. Oh, it's going to be voluntary. But how does this really come to pass? Who's really pushing this? And that's what we have to look at. Is this being marketed to emotionally vulnerable people?
And now they're trying to get people to refuse the spoon feeding. One thing I did want to say about the voluntary thing and with these suicides, there's such a thing as suicide contagion. And in my daughter's case, it was like an atom bomb dropped on our family. Yeah. And several people kind of went off the deep end. 2 people became suicidal. Yes. They were horrified by her death, but so distraught that they thought about it for themselves. We saved both of them, thank God. But that's the kind of, when they talk about suicide now, how horrible it is for the family and all this other stuff. It doesn't matter if it's assisted suicide or suicide. And that's what I keep trying to get hold. I'm working on one group, I found out, that has not taken a position. They're thinking about what should they say about assisted suicide. I found their number. I called them. They were very nice, took the information. And I was very pleased, at least they listened. But this is really discrimination against people, anyone who wants to commit suicide. And they talk about mental health exams, which are not. They're determine competency. Can the patient do it? My last blog, I actually wrote about that, is the psychiatrists are arguing among themselves, should it be required to have a mental health exam like you would for any other suicidal person? And one guy said, no, it's only about choice. And he talked about a young man who was severely burned and on a ventilator. And they said, well, should we remove it and let him die? And the family goes, yes. And the doctors go, well, let's wake him up and see, since this should be a choice. They woke the young man up, and he was going to be severely disabled. And they asked him, and he said, no, I don't want to live like that. So they said, fine. And he died. And he said, wasn't that good? That was a choice. This particular young man had broken his back. And I've had people like that. I had a young man who was 17 who wound up paralyzed after a car accident. He was distraught. He wanted to die. But this was before the right to die and assisted suicide. So we would have called in a psychiatric consult if he had persisted. But instead, we tried to work with him. We wanted to get him medically stable. And one day he goes, I'll never walk again. They'll never do it. And I said, how many people have complimented you on your legs? And he goes, no one. And I said, are your legs the most important part of you? And he said, well, probably not. But he was really deeply depressed. But then his family told me he really loved poker. So one night in our ICU, I had a midnight poker game, and the nurses would take turns caring for patients and playing poker. And he started to laugh. He had the best time. We were so bad at it. And I got caught by some hospital administrators who showed up. Never happened before or since. And I promised I would never do it again. So they kind of winked and left. But that changed his attitude, just that one small thing. And when people are suicidal, it makes a difference. I had a terminally ill person, and she wanted Jack Kevorkian. And someone called me, and they said, we don't know what to do with her. And I talked to her. I talked about the effect on her family, these kinds of things. And she goes, no, I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. But she loved being a very good real estate agent. And I said, it kind of occurs to me, you're so proud of being a good real estate agent. She said, the best in the city. I said, if you killed yourself, committed suicide, everybody talk about you as the real estate agent who committed suicide. And she goes, wait a second, let me think about this. She changed her mind and was so happy. But a couple days later, I was accosted by some women in a hallway. They were friends of hers. They said, we're going to get you fired. You interfered with her choice. This is what the attitudes can do when it's politically incorrect. But that woman had a good life.
That's right. Choice only means one thing to them: be dead. Somebody needs to be killed. And of course, that's really what's happened in abortion as well. It's just a code for abortion.
We've seen this thing about choice. It's interesting when they had the withdrawal of feeding tubes and all, they go, oh, this is great. But then some people started making what so-called wrong choice. And one was a family that refused to withdraw the ventilator and feeding tube. They wanted to give her some more chances, and the doctors wanted to do it. They went to court to try to force the family to let the doctors take away her life support. But they won. And that really bothered them. Also, they are against conscience rights for people like me. They said, if you don't want to go along with the assisted suicide, find another profession. I was almost terminated for turning off the morphine drip. And I was almost had to get a lawyer. I said, I went up the chain of command. I followed it. The nurse wrote it as morphine for comfort, no limit, instead of give him more morphine until he stops breathing. And I was able to get by without it. And I was sure I'd be harassed out of a job. Instead, a month later, some nurses from another floor came up and they said, we heard about what happened to you, and it made us think. We just follow orders and we're so busy. And a doctor ordered too much morphine for a man, and they knew what was going on. And every nurse went up and said, hell no, you give it. The doctor goes, I'm not going to give it. And the patient lived until he died.
When we come back another time, I really want to explore the pressure on nurses in particular in this new culture that we're living in. By the way, on the issue of suicide, please remember, folks, it was up until just recently. Suicide has always been condemned. So many of you know I've written on this, Death as a Salesman, What's Wrong with Assisted Suicide. I write specifically on contagion throughout written history. The first suicide contagion was written by Herodotus. This has always been a phenomenon. Suicide is actually a social disease in many cases, and it can be caught. It's an emotional disease. And that's why society has condemned suicide. If society approves of suicide, you're only going to get more because people are vulnerable. All of us are emotionally vulnerable, and suicide is an emotional decision. So if we don't recognize what we've learned in Western civilization, that this contagion has got to be addressed by the laws, then we are opening a Pandora's box to widespread killing and self-killing. And there's a reason that suicide has been considered against the law. And you can read more about that in Death as a Salesman, What's Wrong with Assisted Suicide. I hope to have Nancy back very soon, because Nancy, as a nurse, has been on the front lines. And as she has implied, a lot of times the physicians aren't actually involved. This has been called physician aid in dying. Do you know, more often than not, there's no doctor there. There's no doctor there. This has been intellectually dishonest. This is misrepresenting how medicine, first of all, should be used, but then how it's really being used. And if there are any medical professionals, it's usually shunted onto the nurses. And so this is a phenomenal situation. I really want to explore that. And I want people to understand this battle, because if you're in a medical situation, you probably haven't prepared. You didn't know that you'd get in that car accident. You didn't know you'd get that call about your aunt. she's got to go to a nursing home. Someone needs to make decisions. You've got to go. If you're not ready, watch out. So Nancy, thank you so much. We really value you, and we want to have you back real soon.
Well, thank you, Brian. I'd love to.
Life Matters continues after this.
Life Film Fest is the creative outreach in Hollywood that's changing Hollywood and the culture. There's many films you've already seen that actually had their start at Life Fest in Hollywood. But more than that, we work with people throughout the industry who want to creatively bring the message of life, creatively impact the culture so that hearts and minds of our fellow citizens understand the depth of what the right to life really is. Be part of Life Fest Film Festival and make a difference.
Go to lifefilmfest.com. And now back to more Life Matters.
Well, welcome back. I appreciate Nancy very much and her timely updates. I want to remind you that you have got to be engaged in this battle of ideas. This is for you because your loved ones are going to be pushed in this direction. Medicine has dramatically changed. Here in California, the California Medical Association says, it's officially neutral on assisted suicide. Well, wait a second. This is the very heart of medicine, never killing your patient. The fact that the California Medical Association says, some doctors want to do it, that means the Medical Association needs to get a hold of those doctors and hold them accountable to 3,000 years of medical ethics. This issue is abroad. It's being practiced. If you're not ready, you and your loved ones can easily succumb. When you receive a diagnosis of a terminal illness, you're going to go through emotional turmoil. If you surrender to those emotions, or if you encourage someone to take their life because of those emotional stages, you are violating more than someone's mere emotional condition. What you're doing in taking that life goes at the very heart of how we should care for one another and the purpose of caring for one another. And specifically, as I said, it's the purpose of the law to protect those who are vulnerable, even if they're vulnerable to themselves. We don't talk people off the edges of buildings to keep sidewalks clean. We talk them off the edge of a building because they're about to consider something very, very wrong. Even if they want to do it, we don't push people off the Golden Gate Bridge. We want to consider and have people consider the greater implications. When someone has a terminal diagnosis, it's not the end of the world. Again, you need to study this issue carefully. If you'd like to get a free copy of my book, Death as a Salesman, What's Wrong with Assisted Suicide, for a donation of any amount over $25 at California Prolife, go to californiaprolife.org, and your donation, when you donate it, mention you'd like a copy and give us your address, and we'll send you a copy of Death as a Salesman, What's Wrong with Assisted Suicide. We'll get that right out to you. This is an important battle. It is a battle for our culture. It is the battle for innocent and vulnerable human lives. Be prepared.
Learn more about everything in today's show at lifematters.life. Life Matters is a production of the California Pro-Life Council, the state affiliate of National Right to Life.